Thank you for listening to the Bladder Battle Podcast special series, I See in the Dark. This series dives deep into the perplexing disease, interstitial cystitis. This podcast is intended to bring awareness and create conversation around the illness by providing possible remedies, tips for managing the disease, how you can show support, and so much more. This podcast is not intended to be a medical alternative for physician care, nor to treat, cure, or prevent any illness or disease. Always consult with a physician for professional medical advice. Today we are talking all about naturopathic treatment and care for chronic illnesses, and more specifically for interstitial cystitis. So joining me today is Naturopathic Doctor Laurel Ash to enlighten us on this type of healthcare and to kind of go into depth about how it could be beneficial for managing and treating IC. So Laurel, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to, chat about these topics with you.
Absolutely. I'm very happy that I came across your Instagram account. You have a lot of great information on there. So I'm happy that we connected. It seems to be the best platform for finding guests for this show. So I think everyone that I've had on, I've connected via Instagram.
Absolutely.
So I kind of just want to get into your background and your personal story with IC before we get into naturopathic care. So why don't you kind of give us a little backstory about your life with IC?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll jump right in. So my personal story with IC. So the story goes back quite a ways. My bladder has always sort of been my Achilles heel. You know, people usually say that they usually have one or two organ systems in their lifetime that are kind of problematic for them. And that was always the case with me and my bladder. So essentially, I was dealing with recurrent UTIs a lot in college. So recurrent urinary tract infections started around that time for me. I was in the school clinic a lot because of that, getting antibiotics. I once got a kidney infection from a urinary tract infection that ascended up, and had, kind of a scary situation there. I'm sure some people on this podcast can probably relate. But back pain, fever, having to go to urgent care. So this was really, becoming a problem at this point. I was always trying to get more information on why I was so prone to these issues. But I would say, unfortunately, I never really got the answers I was looking for. I remember a nurse once told me, just eat more yogurt. And that was sort of the end of it. And, a lot of people with IC are familiar with this kind of advice, which is not always very helpful and not very thorough at all. So finally, they sort of recommended that I take continual antibiotics. And, this was the turning point for me when I really knew that I needed to take my healing into my own hands. I just wasn't really going to find the help that I needed out of the conventional model of medicine. So I saw my first naturopathic doctor, and she really helped me find some alternatives to antibiotics. And that really freed me up and kept me out of that vicious cycle of having to go to the doctor's office all the time. And she also helped me, heal the damage that so many courses of antibiotics did to my body, especially to my gut flora. And that was, really the turning point for me, where I also decided I wanted to be a naturopathic doctor. But there's a lot more to the story. So I didn't know at the time, but I probably had my first IC flare the year after I graduated from undergrad. I didn't know at the time, but my IC really came into my attention my fourth year of naturopathic medical school. So some years later, it kind of really came to the forefront with starting to get the typical symptoms. The urinary tract infection that feels like it never goes away despite having no bacteria in your urine. And, my honestly, my bladder had been through a lot of insults. So I kind of had it in the back of my mind that one day I might develop IC. And I did. All the classic symptoms started to emerge for me. And, there's some grief there and a lot of fear because I was only 27 and facing this chronic illness. I didn't know what to eat because everything seemed to flare me. I was missing class because I was in a lot of pain. Sleep became difficult. A lot of people listening can probably relate to these things.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, I was pretty steeped in the robust naturopathic community here in Portland, Oregon. And I just spent a lot of time learning about this disease. Because I was almost finished with school at that point, my education really put me in a good place to tackle this using what I knew of botanical medicine, nutrition, nutraceuticals, supplements, and lifestyle modifications. So I just really dug into this kind of medicine like I did the first time when I was going through those recurrent UTIs. And now I'm in a much, much better place. And it's sort of my career path to help others as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you have an edge because you're more knowledgeable. You know what you can take, what you should avoid. So you're, a step ahead. But kind of going back to having recurrent UTIs. So were you actually testing positive for bacteria?
Oh, yes. Yeah. There was a period where I was probably experiencing them, I don't know, once every couple of months, which is pretty frequent.
Gotcha.
So, I'd go to the school clinic. At time I was in undergrad at Boston College, test my urine, more antibiotics, Cipro. So a lot of courses I'm sure a lot of people listening can relate to.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, it's just curious because that's kind of how mine started. And I actually got my official IC diagnosis 1 week after I turned 27. So story is very,
Wow.
very similar. So
Similar.
I'm actually, I just got diagnosed in February, officially, but I kind of had known for a while that that's probably what it was. So just very interesting. I can resonate with your story a lot. And yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy being in your 20s and having to face a chronic illness. And it's just one. And, usually there's other things that we deal with and other chronic illnesses that we can get more easily, like autoimmune. There's so many other things going on. So to have something that like I see is just very frustrating, especially when you're young and you're active and you're trying to be healthy, but you don't know what to eat. You can't get a good sleep. So yeah, I can 100% relate. And I think that's incredible that, despite all of that, you still pushed through school and you went on to become a naturopathic doctor. So you should be very proud because, a lot of us.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
A lot of us don't have the energy to go and do things like that. But I sometimes think that, when we're at our worst or we're at our lowest point, it only motivates us to try more and to really just push through it and figure out what we can do. And, even from my perspective, I really wish I could go back and go into the medical field because I'm so much more in tune with my body and understanding these things just from having this chronic illness.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's great that you can provide that personal story when you're helping clients with IC. So great background. I love that, you were able to share that. It's not always easy to talk about.
Yeah. And I'll also, add that, I might be a naturopathic doctor, but honestly, I learned a lot just by hearing the stories of other people with IC. I've been on, the patient, I guess support forums on Facebook for quite a while, and there's a lot of them out there. So I learned a lot through people who deal with this as well. It's very poorly understood in the medical community, and people with this condition, I'm sure you can relate, have to figure out a lot on their own. And so I, as somebody with IC who is helping people with IC, yes, my medical background does help me a lot, but it's also just having been a part of this community for a while and, the trials and errors that we go through as patients who deal with IC is also a huge part of what I draw on for sure.
Definitely. And this topic, it's very interesting to me because I've always been more into nutrition and more natural approach. And I'm actually currently reading the book, The Disease Delusion. I don't know if you've ever read it, by Jeffrey
Oh yeah,
Bland.
I have that book.
Yeah, it's really great to kind of dissect what is Western medicine is really all about and why people with chronic illnesses don't get the answers that they're looking for. Not a lot of people have tried a naturopathic doctor, and I always think that it's a great avenue to at least try when you have a chronic illness, because with Western medicine, we're always trying to treat an infection. And IC is really just mimicking a urinary tract infection. So, of course, doctors, they want to solve the problem. So they solve it with what they know, which is antibiotics. And that's not always, the best solution, especially for our gut. It can just cause a lot more long-term problems.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why don't you give our audience a little bit of background on what a naturopathic doctor is and kind of a little bit more about your passion in becoming one?
Yeah, so to give a background on what a naturopathic doctor is, so there are a number of schools across the United States that license naturopathic doctors. So these are full-time programs. I personally went to the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon, and I still live in the city, very close to my school. So there's a number of, certificate programs out there that you can find online to become a naturopathic doctor. Actually, the first naturopathic doctor I saw she belonged to that kind of program. But what I'm speaking about is very different, what I went through, because these are schools that have their own accrediting boards that are recognized by the U.S. Department of Education. So in Oregon, we actually have, a lot of scope of practice and a lot of recognition, similar to MDs. So we're recognized as primary care doctors. We can bill insurance. We can prescribe a lot of the same medications as MDs can, with a couple of exceptions. And this is all, on a state-by-state basis right now. So there's lots of states that don't have naturopaths licensed at all. There's states like Oregon with really broad scopes that are fully licensed. And then there's states that are, licensed, but we're a little bit more limited in what we can do. So it really varies from state to state. But I think, being in Oregon is a great place for me to do as much as I can for the IC community, because I've been given so many tools here. So I feel like I'm sort of at the epicenter of it all, and it's really great. So that's essentially what a naturopathic doctor is. We obviously draw on botanical medicine, pretty extensive nutritional education in school, also homeopathy. We do some physical medicine, like I call it sort of chiropractic light, because we aren't chiropractors, but we learn sort of the basics of their modalities. So it's kind of like medical school for MDs plus these extra naturopathic modalities. So it's definitely a rigorous, educational standard, which I think is really important for naturopaths to undergo. But yeah, that's essentially it. I was in school for 5 years. I added an extra year because I did a master's in integrative mental health on top of my naturopathic degree. So
yes.
That little background in mental health was, really great, because it just informed me on, how the emotions influence the body with especially chronic pain, with what I'm focusing on. So yeah, it was really great.
Yeah, that's definitely a great addition, because for IC, I think stress is a huge factor in why we experience a lot of symptoms. And then also for those who have, these underlying diseases, autoimmune or chronic illnesses, depression can be a really big factor in how we, as soon as you get diagnosed, usually you don't exactly know how you're going to live with it, how you can go up from there. So, even for myself, I've experienced depression just after getting diagnosed. So understanding mental health in conjunction with, organ function and how your body actually processes different things is really great.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's a really all inclusive medical background. So that's amazing.
Yeah, you're, not alone in flaring from stress. Stress has profound biochemical impacts on our body. That's why I think addressing the mental and emotional world is super important with chronic illness. And it's also why, chronic illness like IC is sort of a gift and a curse. A gift because we are sort of forced to take care of ourselves even, more than, let's say, the average person who, isn't quite so sensitive. So yeah, the curse part being so sensitive, it's tough. It's a hard adjustment.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. So walk me through a typical visit with a naturopath doctor. How does it go? What kind of questions are asked? What should a patient be expecting?
Yeah, so a typical visit with a naturopathic doctor. So I would say that we typically do more thorough intakes than our conventional physician counterparts. So we want to know a lot. We want to know about your family history. What are the health conditions that tend to run in your family? That helps us sort of understand your genetic landscape. And this is really important with IC because obviously it runs with a lot of other conditions like autoimmunity, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, just to name a few. We also want to know, what medications are you taking? In Oregon, we're licensed, so we have to take extensive pharmacology, and we have a good understanding of conventional meds in addition to, naturopathic treatments. So that's also very important. We want to know what supplements you're taking. We want to know about your sleep, your diet, your environmental exposures is a big one. We want to know about your exercise, and this can be a tough one for people with IC with limited mobility, and what are, like we were just discussing, your mental and emotional stressors. These are all crucial to piecing together the puzzle of where your symptoms are coming from. So I would say if you have an appointment with a naturopathic doctor, be prepared to be there for a bit. Visits can be an hour long for an intake appointment or sometimes longer. We just want to know as much as we can as possible. And we're trained to do physical exams. So that might be something that we include in your visit. We might recommend blood work or other types of testing to give us insight into what's going on in the body. And then obviously at the end, we'll give you a treatment plan. I don't like to overwhelm folks, just, giving a couple of suggestions because this is a problem, or this chronic disease is an issue we're going to work on over time. It's took a while to establish itself in the body. And so it's going to take a while to get back to your wellness goals. And that's something that I always tell folks to set the expectations. I'm not promising a cure. I'm not promising a quick fix. That's not how things work. So that's usually the typical visit.
Yeah, you're so right. It definitely takes a long time to come on. So it's going to take a long time to really understand how to treat it and figure out the root cause if you can even get to that point. So definitely having patience is key. So for somebody that has been newly diagnosed with IC, maybe they've gone to a urologist or a urogynecologist and they've gotten the official diagnosis and maybe a couple pharmaceuticals to go along with that. And they're now looking for a more natural approach. They don't want to be on pharmaceuticals. So how would a visit with a naturopathic doctor go for somebody who has been newly diagnosed with IC?
Yeah. So, there's great urologists and urogynecologists out there who deal with IC. I think it can be super helpful to have a naturopath on board because these are conventional doctors in a pretty specific specialty. And naturopaths just have a totally different understanding of the body and a lot less reliance on drug therapy. Although it's something that we are able to do, we tend to approach it more conservatively. So a naturopath just has a different perspective of disease. We recognize that the body has an incredible natural ability to heal itself. If you just remove the obstacles getting in its way of healing, symptoms disappear. So basically, we don't want to suppress these symptoms necessarily. There is, a time and place where that's necessary, just so people can function. And this is important to remember in chronic pain. I'm not about shaming anybody who's on pain medication or is on, conventional meds. That's not what I'm about. But I like to address root causes as much as I can. Usually, the bottom line with IC is we're talking about chronic inflammation. So it can be helpful to seek out a naturopath because their guidance can help you find where the inflammation is coming from and how to turn down the volume on it, because IC has what I like to call this kindling effect. So it's like a small pile of twigs that can catch fire very easily and then grow into a bonfire, right? We've all been there with those terrible flares. People can get flares from a lot of things, just from catching a cold. I've seen it. And this is, like I said, that kindling effect where low levels of inflammation in the body are just going to catch the bladder on fire in a flare. So we really have to be vigilant about understanding our bodies and trying to control inflammation. And there's a lot that we can do, a lot that's in our power to do that, and therefore, relieve the symptoms of IC.
Yeah. So can you kind of elaborate on some of the things that you can do? What are your protocols for treating IC patients specifically? What are some of the different testing or recommendations that you go through?
I'd say basically first you want to address the root cause, right? There's lots of different contributing factors for IC. We've talked about earlier a little bit already how it has a lot of correlation with autoimmunity. I also see, other ones like mold toxicity. I also see Lyme disease. So if we aren't addressing these other root causes, and there are more, that was not an exhaustive list, the inflammation is just going to continue to persist. So anything that we do without addressing that root cause is just going to be not totally effective, if that makes sense. So once we've sort of addressed the root cause, I think specific protocols for treating IC involves a couple things. First, we need to reduce or remove triggers. So we know that people with IC tend to have many, many food triggers. And this isn't the case for everybody, but it is for a lot of folks. And we've already talked about, how it can be extremely confusing to understand what's safe and what's not safe. There's common themes with flaring foods, including spicy food, salty food, citrus, caffeine, especially coffee, unfortunately, alcohol, tomatoes. And this is just really a starting point. But people, also have food allergies and intolerances. And I find, many people with IC can't tolerate oxalates, which are abundant in certain plant foods, such as rhubarb and spinach, just to name a few. So there's a lot to explore in terms of reducing and removing triggers. We just went over food, but there's a lot more, which is probably not within the scope of this podcast. So then once we've sort of removed the obstacles that are in the way of the body's natural ability to heal, it's important to work on soothing the bladder wall. And I like to accomplish this with different botanical medicines. And these two protocols together, removing triggers, reducing triggers, and working on soothing the bladder wall and building it up are going to help people have less pain, fewer flares, and over time actually have more capacity to have those problematic foods every so often, have better mobility, do more activities that they weren't previously able to do. So those are the two basic approaches I treat. And to answer your question about lab work, really all I'm looking for is that the immune system is where it needs to be. And so in blood work, I'm usually looking at, vitamin D, iron, B12, the basics. I don't go crazy on lab work. It's just treating these deficiencies for any of those things that I just mentioned is just going to support the body overall to handle this chronic inflammation more swiftly.
Right. And that's interesting because when I went through a urologist for, what I thought were chronic UTIs, and some of them were actually UTIs, but some of them were mimicking a UTI. So therefore led to the diagnosis of IC. The one thing that was really surprising to me was that the doctor never asked or requested for any sort of blood work.
Right.
Like at all. So to me, that was alarming. Like maybe I'm deficient in a certain vitamin or mineral, or maybe my kidneys aren't functioning at, whatever rate they need to be. These are things that I'm not a medical professional, but things that make sense to me just as a normal person. So I was very alarmed that that wasn't a protocol. So I think that's amazing that for a more natural approach, you're still relying on the main thing that you would get at a primary care visit, blood work. Let's determine what is deficient, what's working, what's not, how are your organs functioning? Those are just very basic things to really start, figuring out a plan for treatment and figuring out maybe there's a connection here. So I think that's great. just pointing it out.
Absolutely agree with you. Yeah. And I think this goes into, these are specialists and they can become a bit myopic with their approach, very focused on the one bladder or the one organ system, in this case, the bladder, and sort of forget the whole person. The bladder is just one organ system connected to the whole body. Naturopathic doctors are always looking at the whole person and how to support the immune system, the basics. It can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I think everything kind of works together. So you can't just assume that, okay, the bladder is the only thing that's causing these symptoms. Because even so, for my case, I get a lot of kidney pain and there's nothing wrong with my kidneys. It's just a symptom of it. So it's like, you got to really look and see how the entire body is working, So I think it's a great approach. It's very functional. One thing I want to go back to, and this is just out of curiosity more for me, you mentioned some of the root causes. So one of them that you brought up was mold toxicity.
Yep.
This might be a very strange connection that I'm making here, but for someone that may live in a more humid climate where there's more molds in the air, and maybe their seasonal allergies are bad, is there any sort of connection with having that seasonal allergy or that histamine response to maybe those molds or pollens that are in the air that could contribute to interstitial cystitis?
Yeah. So, with mold toxicity, we often see chronic sinusitis. So sinusitis, inflammation of the sinuses, and mold toxicity. Essentially, it's very similar to Lyme disease in that it just sets up the body for a huge inflammatory cascade, continually. And if not discovered and addressed, it's going to just continue to do that. And we know that IC is an inflammatory condition, a chronic inflammatory condition. And going back to, my kindling theory of IC, it's a small pile of twigs that catches fire easily. And if we're not addressing, the root cause of where all this inflammation is coming from, the bladder is going to continue to show those symptoms. I live in the Pacific Northwest. It's super moist here. So I think it's even more in the forefront with me and, the patients I see here with it being so wet, for a good portion of the year, because mold loves moisture. And I've definitely heard from patients that their symptoms started after, water damage in their home and things like that. And the tricky thing with mold is that it can persist in the body even years after you've removed yourself from that home or from that exposure, just because the nature of the mycotoxins and how tenacious they are. So that's one of the examples of a root cause that I really like to address if I find it and, investigate if I suspect it in somebody. So
it's very interesting because for me, I mean, of course, stress was a huge trigger, I think, and why my IC even started. But it started after I moved to Florida, which is a very humid, moldy climate.
Yeah.
And I just nothing but suffered from horrible allergies to the point where it feels like I'm just sick with a cold all the time. So I started doing some research of my own, and I was like, wow, there is actually a little bit of a correlation here with the mold toxicity. So when I saw that you wrote that on our little outline for today, I was like, oh my gosh, she might have some insight around this because I haven't been able to find much from any practitioners. So
Yeah, totally. Allergies, your immune system is overactive and it's primed towards an overactive inflammatory response, usually because there's other factors happening in the physiology. And, not to speak on your specific case, but sometimes it's, food allergies or like we talked about, environmental exposure that's chronic and insidious, like mold. It could be other things, there's a lot going on in our environment lately that our body's not really accustomed to dealing with. So it's really case by case, but allergies can be a big problem. A lot of ICers actually get, relief from antihistamines like Claritin and Benadryl. So it's not a coincidence.
It's very interesting. I started taking Claritin just every day, around the clock. Of course, my bladder calmed down and I haven't had any bladder problems. So it's very interesting, the correlation there. So I just started to get curious about it for myself. So
yeah,
it's good information. It's not really widely available when you're, searching on Google and stuff. So
absolutely.
Definitely very, very interesting. So I kind of want to get into remedies that have worked for some of your patients. So any of the suggestions or treatment plans that you've put them on, whether it's the botanical medicines or maybe physical therapy, what are some of those types of things that have worked?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a great topic, and there are so many things. I've got just a couple to name a few. But, for me, I like to try to identify triggers that somebody might not be totally aware of, these like constant low grade persistent exposures that are contributing to that chronic inflammation that we see with IC. So one sort of tip that I have, and I've seen this with a lot of ICers, is water. Water is something many ICers assume is sort of safe and neutral, not really going to contribute to their flares. But I've seen incredible results from people experimenting with water they're drinking, whether it be, alkaline water, pH neutral water, spring water, or even just getting on a filtered water, because tap water obviously has a lot of chlorine in many parts of our country. So I would definitely suggest experimenting with the type of water you're drinking, because we drink water every day. It's a huge, part of our daily lives. So that's something that I've seen actually be really helpful that people don't necessarily think of immediately. Another one that I think of is being a little careful about supplements with IC. So actually, vitamin C and the B vitamins can provoke flares in people. I've definitely seen this. And this is another thing that people just don't really expect to be contributing to their symptoms. Multivitamins are, considered pretty benign, but they can definitely be problematic in IC. And it just has to do with that acidity factor of the vitamins. So that is another one. And I'd say the last one I suggest is a pretty big one, actually, and that's getting into pelvic floor physical therapy if possible. Many of us with IC don't know that we have pelvic floor dysfunction, but it's estimated based on research that I've read that it's as high as 87% in us. And that's, huge. It's massive. And it really makes sense if we think about it, because we know that pain causes our muscles to guard. And the pelvic floor is composed of muscles. So this surrounds the bladder. And in chronic pain, chronic exposure to these painful sensations, our muscles are going to become very tight, which creates more pain. So it's sort of this vicious cycle that pelvic floor therapy can really break. So I recommend in most people, almost all people with IC, check out a pelvic floor physical therapist, try to get an evaluation, because I've really seen it be a game changer.
Yes, I actually had a pelvic floor therapist on the show, and she went into, great detail about what to expect. And, it just sounds like a great treatment out there for anyone that, especially physically active, who may be overusing some of those muscles and not realizing it.
Absolutely.
I want to kind of go back to supplementation there, since that's really a vice for many of us with IC. What are some that you suggest? And, do you have any advice around taking supplements?
Yeah. So I definitely, agree with you on supplementation and how it can be a vice. There are great supplements out there. I'll definitely name a few, but I tell my patients that really the foundations of health are the biggest part of tackling interstitial cystitis. So this is, the basics of wellness, exercise. Consistency is far more important than intensity. You don't have to go crazy. Stress reduction, we've talked about that already. Diet is huge. Making sure you have a good social support system. Super important for our mental health. These are all sort of the foundations that a supplement is not going to cure if any of these areas are, out of balance or not ideal.
Right.
Having said that, I have some great supplements that I usually recommend. So the first would be aloe vera. So aloe vera is a plant, and it has a gel-like substance inside the leaves that we call mucin in herbal medicine. So it has like a mucus-like substance that can be very soothing. We usually think of it in terms of sunburns applied to the skin. It's very soothing, but it can be taken internally too. It can be, taken as a pill form. I've seen it as juice, although I don't normally recommend it as a juice because it's usually preserved with citric acid, which is irritating to IC. But I recommend Desert Harvest aloe vera. They're a great company with great quality control, no preservatives in their aloe vera capsules. And it takes about 3 months to reach its full potential. So I also let people know that because it's just building up that bladder lining. Another one I would say, and it works similarly to aloe vera, is marshmallow root. So this I usually recommend as a tea. I've also seen it as a capsule. But the way that I prepare it is you want the root, not the leaf, because they're totally different medicines. So once you have the root, you want to steep it in hot water. And then actually you want to, once the tea bag has sort of cooled off, like wring it out with your hands. And you'll start to see as you do that, this like mucus-like clear liquid come out. And sorry, mucus is kind of a weird word, but I don't know what else to call it. It tastes totally neutral. It's I've used it for quite a few years, but that's also it's very soothing to the bladder lining because it works similar to aloe. It just coats the surface and provides like that protective barrier that is we know to be deficient in IC based on bladder biopsies and investigation of what's going on with the urothelium. So be sure to steep your marshmallow tea and then wring it out.
That's a great tip because I do actually drink that nightly, and I did not know that you're supposed to wring it out. So thanks for that. I will definitely be doing that tonight.
Yes, pro tip for sure. And the last one that I'll mention to you, I know we're probably getting close to the end here, but it's quercetin. Quercetin is a bioflavonoid, so it's a natural substance. bioflavonoids are found in food, but quercetin is a natural antihistamine. So with IC, we have overactivation of the immune system in the bladder, and histamines are released by the immune system in response to irritation or inflammation. This is why, Benadryl is super effective for people with IC. Claritin, we've already sort of talked about this, but quercetin acts similarly to those medications that you can get over the counter, but it doesn't have the negative side effects like drowsiness, and it can be tolerated long-term. So this is one that I recommend for a lot of folks, especially if they're getting pretty reliant on the Benadryl or Claritin. It's great. It isn't a drug, but it's wonderfully effective.
I will definitely have to try that. I definitely take the aloe supplements, and I've had the CEO of Desert Harvest on one of the episodes. So I learned all about aloe and how they make their capsules. So very informative there. But yeah, I'll definitely have to try quercetin that you just mentioned. That sounds great. Natural antihistamine. So
yeah, let me know what you think.
Before we wrap up, do you just have any tips or recommendations for someone that's looking to find a naturopath doctor?
Yeah, so I would say if you're interested in finding a naturopathic doctor to work with your IC, I will say a lot of naturopathic doctors have limited experience with IC. I love my community, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is a poorly understood condition, and it really takes investment from the physician to understand. I've gone to naturopathic doctors for my IC, and sometimes, they'll have one or two things in mind to sort of help with IC, but not a whole lot beyond that. And it's just because they don't understand. So I recommend, looking into somebody who has spent time with this condition, because similar to, Lyme disease, fibromyalgia, conditions like that, it's still pretty poorly understood, even by the alternative medicine community. You don't necessarily just want to go to anybody. So I'd recommend, if you have a doctor in mind, reach out to their office and ask if IC is something they have experience with. And I'd say, start with that. Word of mouth is another awesome tool. I recommend getting on the IC support forums on Facebook or Reddit or whatever your preferred platform is, and just ask people, who in my area has worked for you guys. I've seen that work too. So you just want to find somebody who has, a bit of experience with this. So that would be my recommendation.
Asking if they have experience with IC is definitely key there. As for you, are you accepting new patients? Do you do any sort of virtual visit?
Yeah, so I am accepting patients in person and virtually. So I am based in Portland, Oregon. My practice is called Ponderosa Health, and I am open to see patients in person. With COVID happening, we have, a lot of social distancing practices happening in our office to keep people as safe as possible. But for those of people who don't feel comfortable doing in-person appointments, I can do virtual, absolutely. We use Zoom, so most people are familiar with that nowadays.
Right.
For virtual appointments. And my website is Laurel Ash ND, all one word, .com. And my Instagram handle is the same, Laurel Ash ND. So if anybody is interested in working with me, I would recommend checking out either of those. You can submit a request over my website to have a new patient visit.
Well, that's awesome. I really appreciate you being on the show and enlightening us all about naturopathic care and kind of what we can expect on our first visit. So, Laurel, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And thank you to my audience for taking the time to listen to us on the Bladder Battle Podcast special series, IC in the Dark. Make sure to subscribe if you're listening on YouTube, or leave a rating or review on Spotify, Google, or Apple Podcasts. And stay tuned for the next episode right here on the Bladder Battle Podcast.